Welcome to A House Divided. I'm Daniel Weinberg, and here at the broadcast studio of the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. We've specialized in Lincoln for 84 years and the Civil War, and we're so happy to have Jon Meacham here once again with us. Maybe next year, Jon, here in Jerusalem, you'll be here in the bookshop itself. We will have the book today I'll be showing you, and we'll have signed book plates for you. But let's start out with Jon Meacham's, the short version of his biography. He's a Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. He serves as a canon historian of the Washington National Cathedral, and you mostly know him as a commentator on politics, history, and religious faith in America, and one of our wonderful talking heads, historians in broadcast studios, news studios, because I think, Jon, the news studio has become the new schoolroom. And we've had so many historians now on there since humanities isn't being taught. We're happy that you and many others are on the news shows. So Jon has been the author of His Truth is Marching On, John Lewis and the Power of Hope, Destiny, and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House, which won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way, American Gospel, and Franklin, Winston, and others. His latest book, And There Was Light, Abraham Lincoln and the American Struggle. It's a Random House book, 676 pages and highly illustrated, and is $40. And if you purchase this book while you're watching this show or afterward, you might be on either C-SPAN or on our YouTube channel, Abraham Lincoln Bookshop YouTube, you will get this crafted book plate that we have. That's our logo. That was produced by Carl Sandburg all those years ago, back in the 1930s. And Jon has these signed for us and for you. So Jon, I want to begin by saying that the book design was really wonderful. I didn't expect how wonderful the design is. It's one of the real selling points besides your writing and insights, of course.
Of course.
And it's placed on beautiful paper as well. I love the paper. And in our shop, we have enough of them, though, to call what we're calling a shelf of eyes from the Gardner photograph that you see. That's what it looks like on our bookshelf. And we're very partial to that image because we had the original glass plate many years ago, back in the late 1990s, and we produced these direct contact albumin photographs from that, just as they did back then. So we're very partial to that particular image, and we think it's wonderful that you used it there. How did the title take place, Jon? How did you get that? Did it come from the Reverend Phineas Gurley's sermon?
First, Daniel, thank you so much for having me. I was last in your shop almost exactly 10 years ago, and I think we were having a battle between Jefferson and Lincoln then. And so I've tried to amend my ways, and so here we are. It comes from Frederick Douglass. It obviously comes from Genesis first, but the great speech from the 5th of July, 1852 in Rochester at Corinthian Hall, when Douglass said, "I do not despair of this country. The fiat of the Almighty, let there be light, has not yet spent its force." And to me, it fell to Lincoln to shed light in that moment because of the nature of the Constitution, the nature of politics. Ultimately, Lincoln became that instrument. And so I do believe that Lincoln himself saw, as he put it, that it's probably his lot to go on wandering through twilight as poor doubting Thomas did. I think that's true, but I think the twilight is brighter because of Lincoln than it would otherwise be.
Well, we feel here at the bookshop, of course, that every major historian, even minor ones, need to tackle Abraham Lincoln. And so after tackling Jefferson and Jackson and others, why did you feel the need to come to Lincoln now?
Well, I now can call it the Weinberg Doctrine. I think you're right. I think he's like Everest. I think you got to climb him. Um, if there's one theme in the books I've done, it's that not that the past was perfect or that the giants once roamed the earth, but that fallen, frail, and fallible people in the past managed, however briefly, but momentously, to transcend their limitations, to transcend their appetite, their ambition, to do the right thing. And Lincoln, I believe, should be seen not as a zigzagger, which I think is part of a conventional narrative, but should be seen as a pretty consistent anti-slavery politician whose scope for action grew according to events. But I believe his heart was largely in the right place over several decades.
Just reminded me of a question that I like to ask, that is, with Jackson and Jefferson and Bush and now Lincoln, whom did you have the most difficulty with getting the inner self, the inner man? Certainly with Lincoln, we know even his friends thought they had him surrounded and really didn't know the essential man. Which of those did you have some problems getting into?
That's a great question. I thought you were going to ask when you started, who did I have the most trouble with? And it was not George H.W. Bush, but it was Mrs. Bush. but that doesn't separate me from anyone else. I adored Mrs. Bush, but I still have some bruises from getting hit by her handbag once or twice. I would say Jefferson and Lincoln are in a close race there. Two men who articulated so brilliantly an ideal of equality and the centrality of opportunity, but both of whom did not follow the logic of their own brilliantly articulated argument. I kind of want to reach back and grab the Lincoln Douglas debates and ask, why you've so brilliantly framed the fact that the Declaration of Independence includes Black Americans. How, therefore, can you not go that next step to a more egalitarian vision? I understand the politics of it, and I'm not being self-righteous, but that is something that we have to confront, is that as far as he went, he didn't go farther. And so to me, parenthetically, the moral utility of history is not to look back on the past and condemn it and feel superior, but to realize if even the best people of the past could get something so wrong, what are we getting wrong now? And we have time to address it before historians come and hold us to account.
Well, I'm a son of a psychoanalyst and the only child of a psychoanalyst. So believe me, I come to you pre-shrunk. And I certainly feel that we all need to look into ourselves to make ourselves better people in society. And we're going to get back to this as well. I want to do a little bit more preliminary things because I want to show people that the illustrations in here are remarkable, many in color. Congratulations on getting Random House to put them in color, and many, many others that are not. And we recommend the book for that alone, and the footnotes, by the way. I'm a veteran footnote reader. How do you get to choose? Did you choose all of these illustrations yourself?
I did. And I appreciate your kind words about the design of the book. I can absolutely brag on it because I didn't have anything to do with it. So I picked the images, but the marvelous designers at Random House who've stood me in marvelous stead for decades now. There's a wonderful woman, Carol Patikny, who has worked with me for a long time, certainly 3 or 4 books, helped run things to ground. And then there's an immense number of raw images come in and then try to find it guiding ideas to break everything up. What I particularly love, if you want to show it, is the part openers, which are we started using in the Jefferson book, which sort of the old magazine land, we used to call it a double truck across. That may be still the term. We live in a that's an artist rendering, of course, of Gettysburg. And so there are, I think, 6 of those.
They're wonderful.
I think
chapters, yes.
We live in an almost entirely visual culture now, and so I'm trying any access point we can create to get folks into the narrative is great. And thank you, by the way, for mentioning the footnotes, which no one ever mentions, but which I spend endless hours upon. It's about
John, I could have made this entire time here. Sometime I want to do this, not read the book, just the footnotes. I could have done this from this particular book. Fabulous material in there.
Thank you. Thank you. I believe we should, obviously stand on the shoulders of an amazing number of people, both living and dead. And so I think laying it all out, giving people as many, again, access points to other works is absolutely vital. This is a collaborative enterprise, right? We're in a remarkable moment in American life, a remarkable moment of division, the very title of your broadcast. And I think people who care about history have a certain common vision. We may disagree about what we see means, but we know it's important to see.
Let me, while we're on illustrations, because those are made up of artifacts, and we, in our shop, of course, have innumerable artifacts besides just books. And so we go toward artifacts because of the visualness, but also the stories behind them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you as an historian use artifacts to help your research and then your writing?
Unquestionably. And there are 2 examples here, at least. You must know Harry Rubenstein at the Smithsonian.
Yes, positively. He's been here. We interviewed him a couple of times as well.
Love Harry. And so he's been great to me through the years. And I wanted to see everything that the Smithsonian had that Lincoln had touched. And one of the things that emerged from it is in the Gardner photograph. You would know this. I certainly didn't. I always kind of wondered, I used to wear bow ties. I always wondered how he managed to tie the tie exactly that rakishly every time, very consistently. Well, the answer is he didn't. That is what the Victorians called a stock. And so it clicks behind. It wasn't a clip-on exactly, but that is actually a bow, a ribbon sewn onto a strip of black cloth that's then hooked around the back of his neck. And so Harry pulled it out, and I was fascinated by it.
One of the reasons they did that in that age is that they didn't want the bow tie to cut off the head as if it's on a platter.
Oh, interesting.
So they put it like this so that it wouldn't be there.
Right. Then, of course, the Lincoln's pockets, the pocket watch and those items that are so well known. The other object that captured my imagination, and I owe Harry for this, was the coffee cup that Lincoln left on the windowsill as he—
I saw that recently myself. Unbelievable.
At his after dinner coffee on Good Friday, 1865, and then leaves the coffee cup and goes off to the theater.
And Elizabeth Keckley, she's the one who saved it.
Yep.
And sent it to I'm not sure if it was the Smithsonian or the Library of Congress with a letter, but they're now split up. The Smithsonian has the cup and the letter is the Library of Congress.
I love government, don't you?
Exactly. I want to ask you this too. One of the artifacts, the earliest maybe I ever had when I was green here, the early 70s, I had his first elective signature. He had just been elected captain in the Black Hawk War, and he signed himself A. Lincoln Captain for the first moment. And you know what he said about that. Of all the successes I've had, that is the one that's given me the most pleasure. But that artifact brought me closer to Lincoln to understand him. What do you understand of Lincoln saying that about that moment in time when his friends and neighbors saw something in him and elected him captain?
It was his first hour of legitimacy. And as we know, he thought of himself, he worried from time to time that his birth had not been legitimate. He worried about his grandmother's birth, rumors of his family's, how to put it, scant virtue. And I think that to have been elected, Harry Truman had the same kind of reaction to becoming an officer in what became Battery D in the First World War. Andrew Jackson had a not dissimilar moment. He was an elected general in the War of 1812. So I think it was an affirmation and a genuine vote of confidence, both literal and figurative, that he could win the confidence of others.
Yeah, and it stayed with him all the way up to the presidency when he uttered those words.
Yep.
Let me ask you this before we get into the book, because there's so much there. A good 3-4 hours if we had the time. About objectivity. When Doris Kearns Goodwin, who you're on this week with as well on TV, when she finished her Lincoln book, she said that she was sad not to be waking up with Mr. Lincoln every morning because she had fallen in love with him. Daniel Day-Lewis, who played Lincoln in Spielberg's film, said that he had never fallen in love with a man that he had not met until Lincoln. And I know I, coming to this bookshop all those 51 years ago, I too, after I got to know the man a bit, fell in love with him. So how do we as historians keep our objectivity when we fall in love with our subject? And did this happen to you?
I don't know that I fell in love with Lincoln. My admiration for him deepened, which was almost more surprising in a way, because I realized he could have done different things. You know, if you see him only as a politician always has a reason to decide to do the other thing. And so secession winter with the Crittenden Compromise, reinforcing Sumter, the refusal to give up the Niagara Declaration in August of 1864. These were moments where this man could easily have deferred the hour of reckoning, and he didn't. And I believe he didn't do it because he had a genuine moral commitment. And so my admiration for that, I'm intimidated, if you will, by that, because I'm not sure I would have done the same thing. I like to think I would have, but one never knows until you're in the maelstrom. And so I'm very admiring of his capacity to overcome the dictates of politics to seek a moral outcome.
Well, that should lead me to another question I have deeper in here on colonization. And when I get to that, I want to talk to him for a moment with you about him as a 19th century man.
Yeah.
We don't have presentism as we're calling it today.
Yeah.
And maybe just what you're saying, it makes us admire him more for what he did, because even Frederick Douglass in his 1878 speech said that just in his day with the abolitionists, he was retrograde almost and slow. Whereas if you look from his time in 1878 or from ours, he does look a bit radical and revolutionary. So let's talk to him for a moment about a 19th century man, because when I first saw this particular wonderful image that I happen to have in here, this is a March of 1863 print that was produced in France when Lincoln had a delegation of the Comanche chieftains in the East Room, and the French and Europeans were fascinated with American Indians, but he had a speech that he gave with this. And what he said in part was fascinating. Quote, "The pale-faced people are numerous and prosperous because they cultivate the earth and depend upon the products of the earth rather than wild game for subsistence," as if the natives really cared for prosperity. But he went on, "But there's another. Although we are now engaged in a great war between one another, we are not as a race so much disposed to fight and kill one another as our red brethren." Well, I suppose he forgot the Crusades and the 100 Years' War and 30 Years' War, and I could go on for the rest of this show.
Yeah.
So what does this tell us about him as a 19th century man?
That he was a creature of that century, for good and for ill. He was a product in many ways of the age of Jackson. If you'll allow me a bit of Tennessee privilege here for a second. Jackson was the first American president not to be a large Virginia slave-owning planter or an Adams from Massachusetts. He was, ironically, because God has a sense of humor, the first full embodiment of what Henry Clay called a self-made man to become president of the United States. And of course, Jackson once said that his only two regrets in public life were that he had not shot Henry Clay and hung John C. Calhoun, his own vice president. Nobody felt that way until recently. But we can talk about that later if you want. So the avenue for a white man to achieve prosperity, to achieve worldly success, to realize ambition, was a path marked in a way by through Jacksonian America. The fact that Lincoln's first appointment, his first election, as you mentioned, was during the Black Hawk War. His first office was as Postmaster General of Salem, named that in 1833 by President Andrew Jackson. And so quite literally, and that was not a hugely important, to say the least, office, but it was an office. And so I think that Lincoln's rise was a peculiarly 19th century one. His prejudices, his shortcomings, his vision of identity and the identity and standing of others is what draws us to him, I think. It's what drew me to him, right? Again, this thing to articulate that quite contra Douglas, Stephen, that the Declaration of Independence applied to all, not to some, but to all, was, as you used to use your term, radical and revolutionary. And it was, to bring up another one of my guys, no one ever had a better posthumous friend posthumously than Thomas Jefferson had of Abraham Lincoln, because it was Lincoln who elevated the Declaration, who elevated Jefferson's works, who spoke so beautifully about Jefferson, particularly in the great 1859 letter back to Massachusetts, I think, where he says that Jefferson had the coolness, foresight, and capacity to insert into a revolutionary document an eternal truth. I'm now paraphrasing. And so the fact that Lincoln could not fully embrace an egalitarian future where Native Americans, where Black Americans stood equally with white Americans is part of the unfolding American tragedy. It is a 19th century context, but we have plenty of problems now. And so one of my big arguments about biography is that we shouldn't look up at the past adoringly or look down on it condescendingly, but try to look it in the eye so that when we look in the mirror, perhaps we'll see ourselves more clearly.
And know that in another 100 years, others were looking at us the exact same way we're looking back then. And I bet they're going to think differently than we do of ourselves unless we
Absolutely.
take action to do something for ourselves. Let me ask you about the moral aspect of slavery and how he came to it. You know, um, why did he why did he feel that the extinction of slavery was going to take so much time? Why was he slow, like McClellan, I guess, in the emancipation effort, as you just mentioned a few moments ago? And what changed him to uh, bring upon the Emancipation Proclamation, which did more than just be a military document, really?
Yeah. Well, he said, as you know, in 1864, I am naturally anti-slavery. I cannot remember what I did not so think and feel. And I think as a lawyer and a writer of great skill, he picked his words carefully. Naturally means from the beginning. I believe that it's important that his parents were part of an anti-slavery Baptist denomination, both in Kentucky and Indiana. There's an intellectual line in that ecclesiastical world that goes all the way back to Thomas Clarkson and William Wilberforce in England, John Leland in Virginia.
John, excuse me, you believe then that Thomas Lincoln, his father, had a hand in Lincoln's anti-slavery thoughts, even though he had to be a slave catcher by law sometimes?
I do. I do. In the sense that it created an ethos in which when Lincoln heard about slavery, it is safe to presume that it was anti-slavery, not necessarily because all these folks were morally righteous, but Thomas Lincoln, poor white farmer, an aristocracy of race, was against his economic interests. And so I do believe that the sermons are possibly, can't prove this, but we know that Lincoln memorized sermons and repeated them. It's not impossible that they included anti-slavery elements. I don't want to rebaptize it. I'm going to be very careful. I'm not I'm not trying to posthumously turn him into some kind of conventional Christian or a Unitarian crusader. He was not that. But if someone is naturally something, then it's incumbent on us as historians to try to figure out what he meant. And the first exposure to slavery, we believe, he arguably saw slave transport traffic on the Cumberland Road. His parents were part of emancipation churches. We all know about the trips to New Orleans and that encounter. And so I believe him. I take him at his word, because also the moment he's in politics, even in the state legislature, he's part of the protest that is an anti-slavery protest. And it was him and a guy who was leaving the legislature to go to an appointment as a judge, so he didn't have anything to lose. Lincoln still had something to lose. And then of course, when he goes to Washington, he stays at a house that was known as Mrs. Sprague's house, which was known as an abolition house on Carroll Row. And so at a certain point, the evidence leads you to ask the question, well, hell, maybe he actually believed this. And, and it was not, again, he was not this Olympian figure who wanted immediate abolition and we were all going to be, crossing the Pettus Bridge together. I'm not saying that. He was not Martin Luther King in a stovepipe hat. I'm not making that case. What I am saying is that contrary to what would have been broad political and racial interest, the white racial interest would have been not to have been anti-slavery. And he kept losing in the 1850s, right? I mean, it was clearly not a big winner in Illinois because he was never Senator Lincoln. This is part of my sense of, yes, I know that a lot of my friends and a lot of people I admire enormously want him to be the great politician. He was a great politician. But to me, the question to answer in this book, and the reason I've inflicted it on the world, because Daniel, I don't know if you know this, there have been a few books about Lincoln. I don't know if the word has reached the Lincoln Bookshop.
I've counted, yes.
Yeah, there are a few. But I wanted to answer not how, but why. Why did he do this? And I believe it's because he thought slavery was wrong. And then, parenthetically, by holding it to its existing sphere, he was being, and I'm being anachronistic here, but to make a point, I believe that his refusal on the Crittenden Compromise and on perhaps negotiating with the South once the proclamation was in place, and of course, remember in 1864, he's running on a 13th Amendment. He's running on that's in the Republican Party platform in 1864. So he believed, my anachronistic point is that I think he's a little like Winston Churchill in May of 1940, that appeasement had run its course. The white North, the Union, had caved again and again. And the language on this from the literature of the period is great, right? Particularly the abolitionists who said, we're being dictated to by the slave power. Frederick Douglass has a great line about the haughty lips of slave owners have long called the tune. It's a paraphrase, but that's the essence of it. Lincoln said no, that if in fact you conceded after winning a national election, then that idea, that golden circle idea, that Havana was going to be the center of a slave empire, and that Nicaragua and Mexico and Terra del Fuego and all these places were going to become part of this. I think slavery, it's personal opinion, obviously. I don't see how slavery doesn't last into the 20th century.
Yep. And that's where I think Lincoln was perhaps wrong about the slow extinction of it. I think it would have lasted. And I want to, there's a touchstone letter for me. And you start a paragraph off, a chapter off, quoting part of it. On page 147, Lincoln's letter to Judge George Robertson of Kentucky, and where Lincoln wrote, he says, quote, "You wrote of the peaceful extinction of slavery. I think there is no peaceful extinction of slavery in prospect for us." Now, Jim McPherson, a great historian of the Civil War, thinks, well, you can't believe just one utterance of Lincoln because that's the only time he really ever did that. And I say, as the son of a psychoanalyst, that one utterance can mean a great deal, can really show the inside of a person who's trying to keep that back. So I think Lincoln was prepared to go for war if it was necessary. He didn't think that the South would do this. Anybody wanted the Union. And so I think his finest hour was stopping the nationalization of slavery. Everything else flowed from that, emancipation and union. And maybe it's like electrons being in the same place simultaneously. I think Lincoln was in the same place simultaneously with union and having to go to war to keep the union. But the ultimate reason to do that and keep the union is because he needed union for the extinction of slavery. What is your thought on that?
I think that's right. I think that peaceful extinction and ultimate extinction are two different things. I don't think everything he did, as you're suggesting, from the time he was elected, was to hold the line. And there's a great debate about how much did he misjudge the politics? Did he misjudge the South during secession winter? I think once he said, talking about Virginia, that they'd line up to the North Pole to keep the offices. There was that. But when the crisis came, he did what he did. And I had not fully appreciated, James Oakes and Sean Willentz and others have written marvelously about this, about the federal consensus, the idea that slavery was fundamentally a state institution, and that because the Constitution did not acknowledge explicitly property in man, that the federal government could only control it where the federal government was predominant, and that was in the territories at that point. And so it's heartbreaking. I'm actually, for what it's worth, this is important but uncomfortable for a white male Southerner to be sort of caveating a painful process through which slavery ended. And I don't mean to praise Lincoln without nuance on this, but the world was the way the world was. And I do believe that if circumstances had not been what they were, slavery would have endured for decades. One of the coldest moments I've had in this office, cold in the sense of wrenching, was, and I'm embarrassed that I hadn't read it closely before, was that in the great 1862 annual message, which ends with the deathless paragraph of fellow citizens, we cannot escape history, the message is about a plan that wouldn't fully abolish slavery until 1900, sitting in the middle of a state paper. And so that said, I do think that Lincoln acted with a moral conviction when he finally could. And to prove this point, all you have to do is look at what other Republicans, other plausible people around him might have done. Seward spoke in favor of the Crittenden Compromise, was not a big Sumter hawk, to say the least. And so things could have gone differently at any point. The one thing that Lincoln stood by was that slavery could not expand. And then when the crisis came, he never gave in on emancipation.
Yeah, and he didn't give in even as president-elect. Thurlow Weed, businessmen meeting at the Willard, and others who wanted him to compromise. And he was the first president to stand firm and say, no, that's principle. The Willard businessmen were saying, even though it's in the platform, let's skirt it. And he said, no, I think that to me is the crux of Lincoln. Let me ask you also now, because it flows from this, about colonization.
Yeah.
And his thoughts on that. I guess have come to a moment that trying to be in his shoes and a 19th century man, I too would have been fearful that the two races could actually live peacefully together, and that perhaps it would be better to separate. I don't see colonization in his mind as wholly racist, because once he understood that Blacks, freedmen, wished to stay in the country, thought that they were part of this country, even though enslaved and now free, that they wanted to be here, and that he changed his mind on colonization at that point and loved it, I believe, mostly. So I don't see it as a racist part of him especially, but that he had a real fear. Could we as two races live together? And we see some, even in the same race, same religion-ish, Sunnis, for instance, and Shia, they're not living very well together. So that's why I wonder about this and wondering about your thoughts.
Sure. Michael Burlingame has written about this in extraordinary detail and with great skill. Two things. I do think it is racist by definition, because it is a vision of action that assigns value to people and decides the fate of people based on their race and no other consideration. Mm-hmm. And so I do think colonization was fundamentally a racist undertaking. Mm-hmm. He did think of it as voluntary, and he did support it in part because, and he's very clear in the record on this, because he believed that white racism was so strong that it would forbid the peaceable integration of the races. And so it's subtle in that sense, but I don't think we do ourselves any favors by tiptoeing around it. It was the fact that it was mainstream conventional wisdom is a mark against mainstream conventional wisdom in the 19th century. James Madison and James Monroe were the honorary presidents of the American Colonization Society. It was very respectable. Henry Clay was a huge part of this, very respectable position. And it's another sign of how one generation's respectability is another generation's sense of a cause of abhorrence. And so I think it's a mistake to judge Lincoln in entirety based on his views on this, which happens in some quarters of the debate. But I also think that it is incumbent on us, if we are intellectually honest and morally open, to realize that we are part of a country that thought that was a plausible thing to do.
Thank you for that education. Appreciate that even personally. This is one of my favorite images of Mr. Lincoln, taken during the debates, Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, done by T.P. Pearson. And this guy, I don't know if I'd want to meet him in a law court or a back alley for that matter. He was a tough guy, no?
Yes, great wrestler. He didn't like sports. I remember going through Herndon's Informants and being interested by that. He preferred reading to hunting and sports, but he was good at them. I think I don't think he was menacing in any way.
I meant really as a character, the toughness in him, in the law court, in politics, as a person.
Oh, I think there was yes. And I think that part of the role of humor was to cloak that. I think that he disarmed people with the anecdotes and the jokes and the puns, but that there was steel in there. And thank God there was, because it ultimately helped all of us.
Let's get a little bit into his character. A number of areas I just want to briefly talk with you about. Ward Lamon, who was a colleague of his here in Illinois, part of the Long Nine, 9 politicians over 6 feet tall, voted alike most of the time. And Ward also became his private security as well. Unfortunately, he was sent to Richmond just before April 14th, and he wasn't there maybe at the time he should be. But I once handled Josiah Holland's 1866 biography of Lincoln. It came out soon after the assassination, one of the first. And he wrote and Ward Lamon, I had his own copy, and he had some annotations in the margins, and he would underline, and there are 2 things that he underlined I want to get your opinion on. He underlined honesty that Holland put in, and Ward said, Lincoln could stretch the truth when necessary.
Sure.
And again, he underlined, Ward underlined love, that Holland said he loved everybody, and Lamon said he loved nobody but was kind to all.
Interesting. The stretching the truth absolutely rings true to me. Most people I know do that, and every politician I know does that. So that doesn't strike me as if I may, particularly insightful on their part. Kind to all but love. That's a fascinating question, because kindness is a manifestation of love, but you can be kind without it. And so my sense is that he was very loyal, which is also a form to some extent of love. And I remember being struck by how moved he was by the first casualty in Alexandria, the young man from Illinois.
Elmer Ellsworth,
Yes.
almost like a son to him.
So that was striking to me, that the war was real from that moment, right? It was not notional. It was genuine. So I don't know that I would think of him. I certainly don't think of him as any more distant or calculating than anybody else most of the people I've encountered in my work. I think there was, I like the back to the kindliness for a second. I think there was a gentleness to him that manifested itself with his family, with his boys, with the cats, remember, the kittens he found at the front in Richmond. There was a sweetness there that, particularly during the war, makes all the sense in the world to me, because you would be in the midst of that carnage. You would be desperate, it seems to me, to find the reason you were doing this. And it was the reason to do it was to preserve the possibility of love and kindness and generosity and liberty.
He signed over 20,000 military commissions alone, sending young man after young man off to be perhaps slaughtered or lose limbs in the war. It had to have an effect on him.
And the pardons, right? Clemency.
And pardons, yes. Plenty of pardons as well. Although at times he didn't. He still had to be president. And I've had a number of pieces across my autographic pieces that he had to put people in ball and chain for the rest of the war, and things like that. But he was like that. And of course, with the Indian natives, remember, he did really pardon over 300 of them, even though he let over 30 hang. And some today think that's racism against Indians. I don't think that he was, his grandfather was killed by one, and he lived in the time that there were Indian depredations as well as white depredations onto the Indians. So I could see he had other things on his mind than Indian policy. But that's another story, perhaps. What I wanted to ask you was about his depressions.
Yeah.
He had that. It was in him. And of course, sometimes he was so depressed that his friends took away sharp objects. But I don't think that he took that step to commit harm against himself. And he stepped back because I think still ingrained in him was that he wanted to do something of lasting consequence before he left this mortal coil.
I think that's right. I think that I have immense empathy for the depressive episodes. I think it's hard sometimes, and you know this from your own family, obviously, from your father's work. This is talk about a pre-Zoloft age. I mean, this is a world where there are no cures. Not cures, but there's no way. The only way to manage it was drink, and that didn't tend to work. And so imagine if one has suffered from depression, and it's so painful and so disorienting, even in an age where if you have access to extraordinary medical care, it can be fairly fleeting. At least its most acute forms can be fleeting. Imagine a world where that's not available. And I think that it's one of the most profoundly human parts about him, that he suffered, he was And out of that suffering came resilience.
Mhm.
And I have boundless admiration for people, even in this era, who have access to again, medical solutions. But in a world where there were no medical solutions, his capacity to forge ahead, I think, is something that we would all do well to remember.
Well, what about his capacity for growth? There's a part of what you're speaking about, I bet. We in the Lincoln world, of course, speak about that big capacity in the 1850s, which is true, the growth
Yeah.
that he had there. But he continued to grow in the presidency as well. Would you speak to that a bit about him?
Yeah, I'm a bit of a skeptic on the growth thesis.
Hmm.
I know it was very early on, right? Horace Greeley said it early on that he was essentially a growing man. And there are a series of similar observations. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others, I think, observed the same thing. He certainly, there's a distinction, it seems to me, between growing and rising to an occasion. And I believe Abraham Lincoln rose to the occasions that presented themselves and that he helped bring about. Again, the fact that he entered office devoted to anti-slavery and acted on it. He acted on it because of the circumstances that presented themselves and the occasions to which he rose. And so he was forever learning. There's no question about that. Also remarkably young when you think about it, right? I mean, you know, he had a crowded life, particularly once he started, once the late 1840s, really through the end. So, you know, it's an interesting debate. Usually what people mean when they say someone grew in office is that they came to agree with them. You know, that's the translation of that. But I think what's remarkable is how devoted he was to the anti-slavery doctrine and to democracy and securing the durability of that. Remember, he saw these things as intertwined, and that if in fact an aristocracy of race could break up a popular government, then popular government would not take root again. And in that, I think he was absolutely right.
There's so much in this book, John, and I urge people to read this book, even with more books than just these on Abraham Lincoln. This one must be one of those on the shelf, and that one gets into and reads and inculcates, because every biographer, I think, comes in from a different aspect of Lincoln. And yours is one that has, of course, been on the minds of other historians, but I think you put it together so well, and especially because it's instrumental, perhaps, in our education, in our time. Let me ask you something a little more general that I've been meaning to ask you in particular, because I've asked other historians. That is becoming president. I've asked others about this. What are the different challenges of a military man becoming president versus a political man becoming commander in chief? What are the difficulties that each has, and maybe which side has the upper hand in doing better?
You know, it's a marvelous question. I'm just going to vamp and answer here. So I've never actually thought about it in quite that way. But I sort of share Harry Truman's view of what he thought Eisenhower would find, which is that Truman said, poor Ike, he's going to think this is like the army. He's going to come in and say, do this and do that, and no one will do anything. And so I think that a military man becoming president, I bet it's harder to go from order to chaos than from chaos to order. Maybe that's the way to put it, right? A politician is accustomed to chaos. And so moving into a situation where the military, at least, is supposed to have a semblance of order, I think that would be easier than to be accustomed to a command structure that responded to your orders into a world where in politics, the tumult of politics, nobody really cares what your order is.
When I asked this of Wesley Clark, General Clark, years ago when he was running for president, perhaps he was, and he was taken aback a little bit because he didn't feel that there was any politics in the military. And at least that's the persona he wanted me to think about. But of course there's politics, because first of all, humans are political animals.
Oh my Lord. No. It's absolutely, that's with all respect to General Clark.
Yes.
That's particularly in the 19th century, right? Which was much more political. Right?
Civil War was.
Oh my God. So no, I'll stand by my answer over the generals on this one.
I agree with you there as well.
Let me amend or revise and extend one remark.
Yes.
I said about the growth. An exception, which I should note, is I do think his capacity to see the world in theological terms, in philosophical terms, did rise. Now, whether that's growth, there was a deepening philosophical consciousness. I think he was a more philosophical, theologically attuned man when he went to the Ford's Theater on that last day than when he was hustled into the city from Baltimore.
Well, was that just a product of the war? And as I was saying, the men he had to put into battle, or did he really begin that early on, actually, even in New Salem and afterward, when he was reading theology and had others books on theology that he was reading early on as well? Did that factor into his morality as well throughout life?
I think it did. I think that he did make a pretty profound study of religion. Was it Samuel Hill? You would know off the top of your head. Was he the storekeeper who allegedly burned the treatise on the Thomas Paine treatise? So I have this theory that Samuel Hill may well be responsible for modern America, right? So by destroying that, he enabled Lincoln to go. It's a little bit like I sometimes credit Bonanza with winning the Cold War, because Bonanza drove GE Theater off the air, which meant Reagan had to find something else to do. So I think it was a lifelong thing. I really do. But I also think that Willie's death mattered enormously on that. He wrestled with Providence more. You can see the references to Providence, the references to God rising, even as he goes from Springfield to Washington in 61. And then, of course, it's informed by the carnage of the war, as Drew Faust and others have written about so well. I find arguably the most profound thing in a theological sense that any American president has ever said was in the second inaugural, when he says that it may well be that every ounce of blood drawn by the lash must be answered by an ounce of blood drawn by the sword. And if that be the case, then the Lord's judgments are true and righteous altogether. Wow. Step back for a second. That's an American president on a winter Saturday speaking before one of the first integrated crowds ever in American life, saying that there's a divine force beyond time and space that is interested in the affairs of a nation, down to casualty counts. You can agree, you can disagree, but we know he said it. And the man who said that I don't think the man who said that would not have said that 4 years before.
Let's talk about his verbiage and his writing and speeches. As you write, words matter to Lincoln.
Yep.
And now he read the King James Bible. And I've found recently, I read a bit briefly, that the translators of the Bible, King James Bible, use what's called archaism, where a writer linguistically would want the language to look and feel old. So what impact do you think King James Bible and that sort of reading might have had on Lincoln's crafting of his own speeches, and maybe even more generally, how he crafted his words? I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I think that the King James Bible is the most important source, in my opinion. He learned tactics, if you will, from Henry Clay. But I think that the spirit, the cadence, those cadences are biblical. And you're right, there was a marvelous book some 20 years ago, maybe, called God's Secretaries, which was about the translation of the King James Version. And, house divided, with malice toward none, Gettysburg. I mean, just almost everything that endures has a biblical overtone. And I think that's important because I also love the story, it's an Elizabeth Keckley story, that one day in the middle of the war, he picks up the book of Job and just starts reading, which sort of tells you everything about how he was feeling, right? So he saw history as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's a very biblical understanding of history. We are in the middle. We don't know what the end will be. And to speak in that kind of elevated language was, I believe, part of his attempt to meet the moment. Part of it also, I think, Cooper Union's a good example. He very much wanted to impress, right? I mean, he was a frontiersman. Remember, he worried about his suit and his collar and all that going to Cooper Union. But the speech, which is a lawyerly brief here and there, but it's self-consciously elevated. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But I think if you look at the Lyceum speech early on, where he talks about the political religion of the nation, you see that, right? There's a through line.
I have the Lyceum speech right in front of me, right here.
There you go.
My question, when he did that in 1838, Ben Franklin, of course, said, "Here's your democracy if you can keep it." Well, I think Lincoln was saying a little bit of that in the Lyceum speech. So what is Lincoln's speech? How is that relevant today? And what especially can Lincoln teach us in our present difficulties? And can that be realistically an influence today? Wow.
Well, the Lyceum speech, absolutely, to me, the takeaway is political religion. His worries about the founding generation disappearing, and therefore living memory of that struggle fading, and his sense that it would not be a foreign power that would undo the American Republic, but that there could be a towering genius who would emerge from among our number. And so in an age where democracy and autocracy are in competition, our own time, and in an age when our version of the founding generation would be those generations from World War II and the post-war era through the civil rights era, that those were people who saw the public sector deliver. Late, painfully, incompletely, but it delivered. The living, and people like us either grew up living in that or a step away from it. And so the stories were real to us. I once asked, or Tom Hanks once was asked, "Why do you keep me making movies about World War II?" And Hank said, "It was good versus evil, and Grandpa won." That was a real, and Lincoln, to some extent, in the Lyceum speech, is talking about the founding generation in that way. It was king versus Congress, and Congress won. So that's one thing. The other is that insistence on a political religion, on a commitment to an idea larger than our own pursuit of power. What does he have to teach us now? Is what he taught us then, which is that the idea of the country matters. I wish history were a GPS system and you could type in coordinates and get somewhere. But let's remember, the great fact of the American story is that hundreds of thousands of white Americans chose to die rather than free fellow human beings. America didn't wake up on January 30th and 31st of 1865 and say, hey, let's pass the 13th Amendment today. And so Lincoln's struggles are remarkably resonant for us because we too have to, as Lincoln might say, rededicate ourselves to this idea and find just enough of us who are willing to sacrifice our short and middle term interest to preserve an experiment in democracy that is designed to create more liberty.
I want to ask you something a little bit off this. His family, very briefly, we're getting past our time now, but very briefly, what's your thought on Mary Lincoln? I mean, she had the prescience to early on to want to find a man who would become president. She did that. But what is your feeling about Mary, just her?
I'm reminded of what Lionel Trilling said of Fanny from Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. An evening with her would not be undertaken lightly. I'm not sure I would have wanted to spend a great deal of time with Mrs. Lincoln. But that said, I think that she saw possibilities in him. He saw possibilities in her. I know that the Lincoln marriage is perhaps as contested an element in the Lincoln scholarship and historiography as anything else, which is kind of remarkable. She caused him a great deal of pain in the White House for being, seen as the scandal stuff was important, but that comes and goes. But the fact that people worried that she was a Confederate spy, that didn't help much. That's not her fault necessarily.
And she wasn't.
Yeah, of course not. But it was difficult. I think that all in, I think she could have been a more stabilizing force for him. But what we don't quite know is whether he did the work to be a stabilizing force for her.
He was, on circuit, which probably was his happiest time in his life. It was probably on circuit. It was probably very meaningful to him, innerly as well as politically. But it kept him away from his family, and he stayed away from his family sometimes when everyone else went home.
Right.
So let me ask you also, and his kids had to have suffered a bit from that as well. Let me ask you about him being a father. You have a wonderful photograph. It's black and white, it's small, but we liked it, of Lincoln and Tad. And it's an interesting story about the photograph itself, just as an artifact, that it has, and if you look below Tad, below the table, there's a line there in the background. And that's what they first took, this photograph in Gardner Studio. And then this is the first version of it, because very soon after they cleaned it up. They happen to have one of those really scarce cleaned up versions right now. And they cleaned it up because they wanted to produce a third version, and that is this right here. That is the one with the background. And they cleaned this up and produced this. Really, this happened after the assassination that this came out.
Right.
So they schmaltzed up Lincoln, of course. There's the cleaned up version you see below Tad. But then this one here, which is the one with the background, is the one one sees more often in the marketplace. So what was his relationship, do you think, as a father? And do you think that it's really realistic that in Spielberg's film, Lincoln slapped Robert?
No, I don't. For what it's worth, Spielberg is. I don't think he's going to be hurt by my my opinion there. I think he, again, as you know, psychoanalytically, children who have difficult childhoods tend to either replicate them for their children, their own children, or overcompensate and overindulge. And my sense is that Lincoln was far more the latter than the former. And so I think he became a very attentive and doting kind of father. Let me put it this way. I would much rather have had Abraham Lincoln as a father than as a spouse.
I was just reminded of a letter from 1859 that we had of Robert Lincoln writing to one of his friends, saying that he didn't know where they were going to send him to college, but just so he got out of there. And I think that was really more his mother than his father. But I also want to defend him, by the way, for him putting his mother later into an institution. I think she needed to be there, and he got her out as quickly as he could when she was able to. He and Mary Harlan, his wife, certainly didn't want her in their home when she couldn't live alone. Mary didn't want someone to live with her. I know that from my own mother, how we had a place for her in another bedroom. So when the time came, but she fought it tooth and nail to have someone there. Mary Lincoln did too. And her sister Elizabeth in Springfield was ill at that time and couldn't bring Mary to her. So I think he put her in just to keep her safe and then got her out. That's just my idea. So it was a very complicated thing. All children and parents, families are complicated beyond our own knowledge. And these are just little insights into it. Is there anything before we leave each other, Jon, that you would like our viewers to know about you and this book? For instance, maybe briefly, how did your religious feelings and atmosphere bring yourself into this book?
I am a Christian. I'm not a very good one. As Robert Louis Stevenson once said, the duty of a Christian is not to succeed, but to fail cheerfully. And so if that's the case, I fail cheerfully all the time. I'm very open about my religious affiliations. I'm an Episcopalian, as you mentioned early on. I, again, want to be very clear that I don't see Abraham Lincoln as a conventional Christian in any way. I think probably he died as a kind of Unitarian with a dose of New England transcendentalism of Parker and Emerson. I believe there's no doubt that my interest in this part of human experience informed what I'm doing. Part of it is taking someone seriously for what they say. And Lincoln talked about this, as you know, a lot. Some of it was conventional rhetoric for a given moment, but not all of it could be. And so in the panoply of human experience, in the mix of things in our heart and mind and soul that lead us ultimately to make the decisions we make, religious feeling, philosophical feeling, a sense of what the right thing is, what we're called to do, plays a role. Not always decisive, but it plays a role. same way economic interests always play a role, but they may not be decisive. We're big, complicated people. And Lincoln was, as Du Bois said, a big, inconsistent, brave man. We're all inconsistent. I think what's so remarkable is that Lincoln was so big and so brave.
John, you don't have to be a religious person. You could be an atheist and still enjoy and get a great deal out of this particular book. I know I did, and I think others will as well. It's nuanced. There's so much more in it that we could not cover today. And I really hope that people will take this book to heart and read it for all its nuances and what it can teach us today individually, as well as learning about history and how we should, as people today in the present, approach the past. We still will have this book after C-SPAN puts it on, and we will also have this wonderful book plate that John has written quickly, his hand. I think I could maybe forge that though, and I have a big Lincoln forgery collection, by the way. I'll give that a try, but you won't get it, you out in viewerland. Thank you, John, especially for being with us. Thank you, viewers on C-SPAN and on YouTube if you're watching our House Divided afterward. And we invite all of you to join our House Divided interviews in the future by coming to our website, alincolnbookshop.com, and you'll be able to see this and many others on our YouTube channel. Thank you again. We'll see you again. Peace.